Good evening, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today for this evening's webinar. I am Brian Irvin, Comms and Engagement here at Cray. As you may already know, here at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, we are a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within UCL's Institute of Education and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. Here at Cray, we aim to conduct high quality, cutting edge research, but also to ensure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from it. This Cray webinar series is just one part of that, allowing people both within and beyond academia to hear from some of the key researchers, practitioners and advocates in the field. Through everything we do at Cray, we take a participatory approach, which means we work with autistic people in all stages of our research and initiatives, from the initial design right through to the sharing of the outcomes. We hope that this means that the work we do is meaningful for the wider autistic community. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to all our funders, supporters and team members who contribute to our work and make it all possible. In particular, a special thank you to Pears Foundation for their generous ongoing support that underpins everything that we do. As always, we invite you to become part of the question, either in the chat or with more anonymity in the Q&A. We'll stop recording after Jada's spoken and we'll endeavour to have as many questions answered as we can. Today, we have the wonderful Jada Brown. Jada is a doctoral researcher in the psychosocial studies at Birkbeck College, University of London. Her research explores themes relating to identity, belonging, and the systems and structures that contribute towards academic and social inequalities experienced by racially minoritized autistic students. She is dedicated to addressing issues surrounding diversity and accessibility in autism research by centering anti-racism, anti-coloniality, and, I do love this phrase, cultural humility. So Jada, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. And thank you to the wider Cray team for having me here today. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to share some of my work that I've been doing over the past few years. I'm just gonna share my screen. Brian, can you see that screen? Perfect. Okay, so this presentation is going to be just speaking a little bit about what I've been doing over the past couple of years throughout my PhD. I'm currently going through the analysis phase of my research, so this is kind of going to be like a stream of consciousness, a stream of my thoughts, thoughts that are not yet fully formed, but I hope it will be interesting nonetheless. So thank you for joining me and listen to me ramble for the next 35 minutes. So the title of this presentation is the embodied understanding the experiences of Black autistic university students in the UK. So just to outline how this talk, the structure of this talk, I'm firstly going to just introduce myself and then speak a little bit about the background and theory of the research. I'll then outline my research questions, really briefly touch on my methodology, and then spend a good chunk of the talk speaking about some emerging themes, some patterns that I'm seeing emerging from the interviews and the discussion board that I did. And I'll end by talking about some hopes and dreams, where I want my research to go and what I'm planning on doing next in the next year or so. So a little bit about me. I am a final year PhD student, as Brian said, at Birkbeck College, University of London in psychosocial studies. I have previously worked as an equality, diversity, inclusion officer, a learning support assistant, a tutor, a research associate, and an after-school carer to two fabulous autistic children. I am an anti-racism and anti-ableism advocate, activist and ally, and beyond academia, I love cats and crocheting. And there's a picture of my cat on the screen just because I wanted to include a picture of my cat in the presentation. Okay, so a bit about the background. I don't have much time to speak about this, but I think it's useful to share with you anyway. So I began my PhD by kind of looking at the different lenses through which we can understand and think about autism and neurodivergence. So I think it's useful to share with you some of the models and paradigms that have kind of influenced my thinking. So firstly, the social model of disability, which emphasizes the way systemic, social, and structural factors produce disability. The theory of complex embodiment, which recognizes the relationship between internal embodied experiences and social representations of the body or body minds. The neurodiversity paradigm, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, which rejects this idea of a normal brain and recognizes the power that's kind of subjected to neurocognitive differences. And also critical autism studies, which really values and legitimizes autistic ways of being in the world. It's a really short summary of all of those. But I think together these paradigms have worked together to oppose this kind of pathology paradigm view of autism. So kind of rejecting these deficit-based assumptions of autism towards this view that autism can be constructed and experienced based on several social, structural, political, and cultural factors. So my research aims to center Black autistic lived experiences in the production of this knowledge. So I'm really trying to emphasize the multidimensionality and legitimacy of different autistic ways of being. So these models have been really, really useful, obviously, especially for kind of transforming these pathological assumptions surrounding disability and autism. But one key limitation of them, I think personally, is that they are too white. So they rely on knowledge and epistemologies that arise in predominantly global North social locations, and they're limited to white autistic people. And when I'm talking about autism studies having a problem with whiteness, I'm not just talking about the presence of white people, but rather whiteness as an ideology. So as a set of like cultural practices and this like structurally advantaged position from which white people view themselves. And this problem with whiteness can be traced back to a lot of the historical associations between race and disability. So my work is, I'm really influenced by many kind of Black disability scholars. So scholars such as Sammy Shulk, Tariq Pickens, Talila Lewis, even people like Toni Morrison, who emphasize in their work that anti-Black and racist stereotypes and ideologies have always positioned Black body minds as abnormal, as deviant, and as defective. And this was especially evident in the colonial context, where colonization was this process of creating racial hierarchies based on scientific racism, but also ableist ones, where able bodies and minds were conceptualized as kind of hierarchically superior to disabled ones. And I think these ideologies have pervaded the autism diagnostic space, the clinical space, but also the educational space, which means autism is routinely linked to whiteness and disturbance is always linked to Blackness, let alone kind of any non-Western or Indigenous conceptualizations or language relating to autism or autistic traits ever kind of entering the academic space, which I think is really problematic. And this has had really serious consequences for Black autistic people and communities, both materially and epistemically. So, for example, not enough attention is paid to the intersectional violence that happens when ableism and racism intersect with one another. So, for example, in police encounters, experiences in social care, experiences in the criminal justice system, work and career experiences, and in my research, education. So my research is an attempt to kind of counter what Malone and colleagues call the scholarly neglect of Black autistic adults, which is the under-acknowledgement of their needs, their desires, their struggles, and their lived experiences, and the failure of research teams to recruit racially and ethnically representative samples. So I've chosen the context of higher education for many reasons, but I'm very much a believer that society's institutions and the organizations within society reflect wider societal values. And I think this is really evidenced when we look at the characteristics and culture of higher education. In particular, I want to focus on how ideologies of ability and whiteness have worked to create this idea of an institutional norm. So if we think about the university has very particular values and expectations of its students. So They want their students to be self-directed, they want them to be autonomous, they want them to be independent. And students who can easily adopt this way of learning become the institutional norm, which is really problematic for disabled and neurodivergent students whose ways of being and learning are perceived as abnormal and unconventional, especially if they need support to access this environment or to access the curriculum. And so disabled and neurodivergent students are always kind of positioned as less capable and less intelligent because of this. And this kind of evidence of what Elizabeth Rudolsky calls a neurotypical hegemony. And it's this idea of the dominance of neurotypical norms and ways of being in institutions as being the correct one. So neurotypicality is the correct way to be. And Jason Arday and Chantal Lewis, they write about this, but they also write about how the neurotypical hegemony is also racialized. And by this, they mean that the system of power that validates neurotypical experiences as the norm also makes these norms race specific. So it centers a white standard of being normal. So expectations about cognition, about behavior, about communication, they don't just affect neurodivergent students, autistic students, they also affect racially minoritized students. And it can explain many things. It can explain why Black students are always denied traits like academic giftedness and intelligence. And when they are given traits like academic giftedness and intelligence, it's just an example of Black excellence. And so these are ideologies of normalcy, and they're very pervasive within UK higher education, and they position students who don't fit this institutional norm as what Nirmal Puar calls space invaders. So these students are marked as not belonging, and they're marked as being out of place. Yeah, so these ideologies have really impacted Black and autistic students, and have caused some quite significant educational disparities. So this is kind of a snapshot, but if we really briefly look at some of the statistics, we're seeing increasing numbers of autistic people entering higher education each year, yet autistic students still continuously show higher rates of dropping out. They're showing increased mental health problems, negative experiences such as burnout, and many of them continue to feel like they're not appropriately supported. Black students also still represent a minority in the university space and continue to be at a disadvantage when it comes to educational outcomes, even though people will constantly talk about the awarding gap, you know, becoming increasingly closed. So for example, in 2021, 2022, 83% of white students received a first or 2-1 degree compared to only 62% of Black students. And we know from the extensive research conducted in the UK, especially from a critical race theory framing, that institutional racism and microaggressions, or what my friend and colleague calls subatomic forms of racism, they're very commonplace in the daily experiences of Black students and Black people more generally. But we currently have limited statistics regarding intersectional student characteristics, which I think is really problematic in itself. But it means we have little knowledge of how like the educational outcomes and experiences of Black autistic students and how they interact with the wider university culture. And I think that's where my research comes in. I really want to like holistically capture what it's like for Black autistic students to exist as a student at a university in the UK. So some of my research questions, based on all of that brief information that I've given you, I wanted to find out 4 main things. So I was trying to find out how Black autistic students make sense of their identity in higher education, what are their academic and social experiences, how they navigate this kind of neoliberal colonial university with, and as I discussed, with its racialized and neuronormative expectations, systems and structures, and then think about how an understanding of these 3 things can better inform practices within higher education. So that's where I went into my research, and that's kind of informed my methodology and the things that I'll briefly discuss here. I wish I had more time to speak about my methodology because I think it is really important, but I don't. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me at the end. So really briefly, my research centers disability critical race theory as this kind of central theoretical framework. And I've done that due to the way it emphasizes the way racism and ableism are interrelated and co-constitutive. And by that, I mean they are reciprocally formed and they're shaped by one another. One cannot exist without the other. I also center critical phenomenology in my work since I'm focusing on lived experiences, but crucially because I'm attending to the way power and history shapes people's experiences. And finally, I've worked with an incredible autistic lived experience advisory group throughout this research. And I would love to, I could speak about that all day, but and I'd love to talk more about this with anyone who are interested in participatory research. So perhaps that's something we pick up in the Q&A. Briefly, my participants. So obviously I was looking for students who identified as Black or Black mixed race, so from an African Caribbean or mixed African Caribbean background, had a formal or self-discovery of autism, and either be currently studying or have recently graduated from a university in the UK. Just a quick note that all of the students who were part of this study were students with lower support needs, and I think not having any students with high support needs kind of influences the interpretation of some of my results and kind of misses a specific demographic, but that's a problem for another time. So together with the advisory group, we chose two qualitative methods. One was an online discussion board on Padlet, and that was to allow for a greater number of students to participate in a little bit of more of a convenient format. Although there was a little limitation of the time commitment involved in that. So the board was open for 8 weeks, and each week I posted a question or a discussion prompt on the board, and the students could respond to it in any way that they wish to, as well as having the opportunity to comment and like each other's posts. And then after that, I conducted flexible interviews with a group of students, individual interviews. And the aim was just to get the reflections on being a student and what it was like for them to be at university. So I included open-ended questions, and the questions were designed to elicit information about their identity, their social experiences, kind of everyday student life, and how they kind of imagine an inclusive and accessible and anti-racist higher education. So hopefully I haven't rambled on that bit too much. A lot of things have come up in this research. I am doing an analysis that is inspired kind of by interpretive phenomenological analysis. That was a mouthful. Which involves doing individual analysis first, and then looking at individual themes to create collective ones. I'm only at the point where I've done individual analysis at the minute, so I've yet to make proper concrete connections and make them into collective themes. So these discussions are quite fragmented and are more kind of representing what's the connections I've made in my head so far. So please bear with me. But I'm going to first talk really briefly about several different ideas that have come up before then speaking about one or two in greater depth. So yeah, these are some themes that I'm seeing. So firstly, the students have discussed the highs and lows of navigating their identity as a Black and late discovered autistic person. Only one of the students was diagnosed as a child, and I think that was really interesting. And being a late discovered autistic person, it meant that they've engaged in quite innovative and creative approaches to navigate and self-accommodate their new discovered identity. So a lot of identity politics is involved, especially when seeking greater self-determination and freedom for themselves as autistic students who are also racialized as Black in predominantly white institutions. I also found that the environments and practices were often inaccessible and unaccommodating for them in terms of the university sensescape. So how environments are experienced in terms of the different senses. And I think that speaks to issues we know a lot about already. You know, how universities and the environments are just not designed to cater to neurodivergent students. But the students discussed their own individual strategies on navigating these environments, which I think speaks to wider themes relating to institutional power, disability acceptance, as well as the kind of benefits and pitfalls of the current disability support system. Students also spoke a lot about the importance of neuro-affirming and anti-racist practices as determining whether they felt supported by the university, but particularly by their supervisors. And when this kind of neuro-affirming and anti-racist practice was absent, it really impacted their self-confidence in academia as well as their mental well-being. And I think it draws attention to wider views relating to the institutional conceptualization and view of disability and neurodivergence, the rigidity of some of the practices of many of the academics who were actually quite stuck in their ways and unwilling to adapt and change. But also the importance of epistemic representation in the university and how important it is for things like anti-racism and anti-ableism, that understanding, knowledge, and training to actually be embedded within one another. Yeah, because students who felt like their knowledge and their worldviews were understood and accepted and validated tended to have better experiences in their whole university time. And finally, all the students demonstrated various instances of resistance, especially to the neurotypical and Eurocentric norms in their university. So, and these resistance were sites of empowerment and agency, and they all recognized their unique embodiment and their unique knowledge and the value of their existence as a Black, autistic, and usually multiply neurodivergent student. So I'm now going to speak on some themes now that I've been thinking about a little bit more and that I hopefully can provide a little bit more information about. So finding their home place. So Bell Hooks, which many of you will probably know of her, she spoke of this notion of home place. So this idea about constructing safe places where Black people could heal the wounds of racist domination and where they could create communities of resistance in white supremacist societies. And I found that the students' search for friendships and social connections with others like them reflected this very notion of creating a home place. So creating their little communities in their institutions to create their own feelings of belonging. So the students really valued making friends with other neurodivergent people, firstly, for feelings of safety, knowing that their ways of like moving through the world, moving through the university would be embraced rather than criticized. And connecting with other neurodivergent students really helped them to develop their sense of self-identity, especially for those who discovered they were autistic during university and were on this kind of long journey of self-understanding. So one of the students, a quick note, I'm not using any of the students' real names. These are all pseudonyms that I'm going to use. But one of the students, Maya, also pointed out that she ended up making friends with people who were neurodivergent unintentionally. They kind of caught like wildfire and ended up just flocking together. And I think that's kind of rooted in this principle of homophily, this tendency to associate with others who are like you. And in these groups, the students felt less pressure to mask and less pressure to conform to neurotypical institutional norms. But at the same time, I also found that the students found that they really were searching for friends who were Black and Black mixed race, and this was really, really important to them. So they had these instincts and urges to be connected to other Black students for feelings of kind of physical and psychological safety. So one of the students told me that she thinks if there were more Black people, she wouldn't feel this way being that she doesn't belong there. And just returning to Bell Hooks said that we can't learn to love and respect ourselves in the culture of white supremacy. And this was really demonstrated by the students. So they're really yearning for these Black spaces of mutual affirmation where they can kind of counter this kind of overwhelming feeling of invisibility. But what was also significant, which I found was a recurring theme in many of the students' narratives, was that they experienced tensions being both Black and autistic. So they felt like they didn't belong in Black spaces as an autistic person, and they didn't belong in autistic spaces as a Black person. So making their home place in universities for a multiply marginalized person was more complicated. So one of the students, Imani, she told me, I have less Black friends than I would like because I think a lot of Black people clock me as being Black in the wrong way and being a little too weird. So there seems to be this idea that there is a correct way to be Black, and if you don't fit the typical stereotypes and characteristics, it can cause marginalization in your own community. Another student also told me about her frustration with the inaccessibility of the African Caribbean Society. And I think if you've ever been to an African Caribbean Society or know about them as a Black person, you'll know they have their problems anyway. But she said being in a predominantly white institution in a city north in England, she said that African Caribbean Society would be the ideal place for her to navigate all these feelings. But the events and activities were just too big and too intense. And it was mentioned by several other students that spaces specifically for Black people were just not accessible for them at all. So this wider theme about Black spaces not being conducive to autistic and neurodivergent ways of being. And I'd like to focus on this a little bit further in my analysis, kind of noting the nuances of their experiences in finding their social place that kind of accommodates their multidimensional identity. Excuse me. And this is a related theme, and this is kind of connected to the other one, but something I thought it would be really useful to draw attention to. And it's how kind of the double empathy problem plays out in social interactions where there are particular cultural social norms. So for those of you who don't know, really briefly, the double empathy problem is a theory created by autistic scholar Dr. Damian Milton, and it basically says difficulties in communication between autistic people and non-autistic people is a two-way thing. It's neurotypical people not understanding autistic people, and it's autistic people not understanding neurotypical people, which is what causes this breakdown in communication because they fundamentally have different ways of moving and communicating and living in the world. It's not just autistic people and autistic people and neurotypical people. It exists within and across neurotypes as well. But I definitely found evidence of this in the students' experiences, especially when they were speaking about how they just didn't get when people said university was like the best social experiences that they'll ever have, because they just like didn't understand a lot of the things that were going on there. But important, I want to draw attention to this quote by Diana. So I'll read it out to you. She said, I know Black people here, we're very, very generous. We are very nice. We want to speak. We want to have a conversation like I've known you for 20 years. So you go to a conference and somebody is speaking to you like we've been friends for years, and then I have to perform because I have to be nice. And then after that, I leave, and then I get home and I'm like exhausted. And I thought this was really interesting. So as a PhD student, she's noting how Black people in the academic space want to be nice and speak to each other and build community in an institution and culture that regularly invalidates us and pushes us to the periphery. And her use of we kind of really reflects this. She feels part of this Black community. Yet at the same time, she references feeling like she has to perform in social interactions because the culture demands it. But acting and performing in this way is really exhausting because she's not being her authentic neurodivergent self. And these are situations that as an autistic person, she just doesn't really want to be in. But she does want to be part of this Black community. And this is something that has come up in many of the interviews, the difficulty they feel navigating a largely neurotypical Black community when they actually don't know how to be part of this community in the way that's expected of them. It's this idea of compulsory neurotypicality present in Black spaces. And often when you're part of a like racially or ethnically marginalized group in higher education, if you can't find Black neurodivergent friends or Black autistic friends, there might be a point when you have to make this weigh up which matters more and kind of choose your group, which is not going to work out for you when you need both of those things. And I think it's why when we're thinking about autistic experiences, race is really important to add to the analysis, because specific cultural, social expectations can really intersect with autism to impact your social experiences. And I think it also speaks to wider themes relating to representation, and that perhaps sometimes it's not enough to have just Black representation and just autistic representation, and how for many of these students, how important it would have been or is to have Black autistic or Black neurodivergent representation in both the staff and student body. I'll briefly touch on this. So many of you are probably aware of the theory, the attention theory of monotropism, which kind of describes the tendency to focus deeply on a small number of interests at a time, which leads to immersive sensory experiences, depth of interest, but sometimes makes it hard to switch tasks and process multiple inputs at once. And it's associated with concepts such as hyperfocus and flow states. And it's not necessarily limited to autism, but is highly associated with autistic ways of thinking. But I found that this kind of attention style was really like a double-edged sword. So on one side, it was really beneficial for many of the students. So, for example, doing work at university that was intrinsically motivating for them and that they could become absorbed in was like a really positive experience, and often fueled a really enriching academic experience for them, and enabled them to produce really high quality work. And this is what one of my students spoke about. She was speaking about how the work that she's done she exceeds master's level. Just because of the nature of how she works, she really has to go down rabbit holes and understand everything, just to write a small bit of content. And I found that for the postgraduate students as well, especially the ones doing PhD study, this way of learning and focusing really allowed them to do a deep dive on the things that they were most passionate about and develop a pretty expansive expertise. So PhD research in particular suited a monotropic attention style as it was related to the common autistic experiences of information seeking, of pattern recognition, of making connections that other people might not notice, and really figuring out how things work. And many of these students were doing PhDs and going to university for that learning, for that intellectual stimulation, rather than for material and financial gain, which I think is amazing because it kind of disrupts this the neoliberal and capitalist agenda of universities. But on the other hand, I noted several different struggles as a result of a monotropic attention style. So students feeling like they are unable to start tasks, such as assignments and revision, especially after changing their attentional focus. One student spoke about not being able to start assignments like at all, which was never to do with the workload or the task itself. She just experienced this mental barrier, which increased her stress, caused experiences of burnout. And for this particular student meant that she had to repeat a year, which, increased the longevity of her bachelor's degree. Other students have also spoke about having a monotropic attention style has meant focusing on things that wasn't their university work, and that was actually detrimental to their well-being. So one of the students, Kai, told me that it feels like at a certain point, politics is the only thing that's worth focusing on, and not in a good way, especially as someone who feels like he's on the front line of all of that, or who can be the most affected by things. And I think many of the students felt like they had to engage in projects and reading and work relating to anti-racism and anti-ableism based on their own intersectional lived experiences of being marginalized, which were, of course, rewarding in many cases, but in many cases like becoming absorbed in all this negative information about the world, about people like them, really caused a deterioration in their mental well-being and impacted their ability to participate and thrive whilst they're at university. Yeah, and I also think it hints at like the additional labor required by you in when you are multiply marginalized. Yeah, and I will explore that further when I get further in my analysis. And finally, the last thing I would like to touch on is just it's just a slide with random thoughts, but all these thoughts kind of relate to this particular intersection between race and autism, or race, autism, and their other identities. One of the things that multiple students have brought up when discussing their experiences of discrimination or any negative their experiences that they've had is this idea that they could never really determine how whether they were being treated badly because of their race, because of their autism, or because of their gender, or all of them. And actually how exhausting and traumatic it is to consistently have to overanalyze your everyday interactions and experiences just to see if it's evidence of discrimination or racism, and kind of see which one it is. So one of my students told me that when people perceive her to be disinterested or disengaged, she's not sure whether this is because of her skin color, because there's not many Black people, or whether this is autistic traits. And another one said that she doesn't know if it's more of a Black woman thing, and she hasn't really figured out where to place that in her marginalizations. So she's acknowledging that she's being marginalized, but is struggling to locate what exactly is causing it. So there's a lot of sense making going on, and I think I definitely want to explore further the emotional and psychological toll that this takes, whilst also then having to complete their studies. Several students have also discussed having to constantly think about and modify their behavior so their peers, staff members don't interpret it in the wrong way. So one of the participants, Maya, told me a time where she really had to think about how she was reacting to a particular circumstance where she experienced ghost authorship, which is being intentionally left off an author list of a paper that you contribute to. So she felt like she couldn't experience the big emotions that she was feeling and react accordingly because the people would think she's over exaggerating, falling into the stereotypical trope of the angry Black woman. And as an autistic person, she said she really feels her emotions so intensely and strongly, and it becomes embodied. The situation didn't end up going very well for her. But you can see how in this example, how race, autism, and gender are all working together. So that they haven't just denied her intellectual kind of validation and acknowledgements. They've also denied her this basic human experience, both basic human emotional experience, and hasn't allowed her to experience her emotions and react to them in a way that feels most natural to her. Ableism at its finest. And finally, I noticed that many of the students' university experience involved having to regularly advocate for themselves and their needs, which for most people was quite exhausting by the end of their degrees. And one of the students, Kai, he told me that having to advocate for your best self is exhausting and will often take away and detract from things that could be a lot of assistance for you, which kind of hints at this idea that, you know, self-advocating, advocating for others can often be a hindrance rather than facilitate support, especially if it doesn't actually relieve to your improvements in your kind of material life. The students spoke about having to constantly inform staff members when they weren't being inclusive in their practice, so when they were being ableist and when they were being racist, even including students who had a formal diagnosis. So the students that had a formal diagnosis, their needs were literally written down on paper, and they still weren't given what they needed. So much of this self-advocacy was more a necessity. And when listening to the students speak about this, I was kind of reminded about the values and philosophies of many African diasporic traditions where advocacy for yourself is thought to be for the benefit of the community, for collective well-being, which I really saw embodied in many of the participants' views and their work. They wanted to advocate for themselves, but they weren't just doing it for themselves, they were doing it for other students who are like them. So I definitely want to address this impact of having lived experience of intersectional oppression, whilst also feeling the responsibility to empower and transform the lives and others who are like you, who are existing in these physically, psychologically, and epistemically oppressive environments. So yeah, that is what I'm working with at the moment. I'm excited to progress further in my analysis. I think it's important to also let you know that it might seem what I've presented so far is negative, but the participants' experiences and their narratives were not wholly negative. Their stories were full of hope, resilience, strength, authenticity, uniqueness. And I hope that when I finish my analysis, I can actually really illuminate these aspects more. I felt like I couldn't do them justice today because I haven't thought about them as much. But I really don't just want them to be Black autistic narratives of suffering and struggle. There were so many positive and amazing aspects of their experience that I really want to share. And relating to that, one of my main priorities going forwards is doing the students' experience justice. I've had some really incredible conversations with some incredible people. And I really want this research to be a spotlight of their experiences. And I feel an intense responsibility to represent their experience accurately and thoughtfully and meaningfully. And I think continually practicing reflexivity will be important, even going into the write-up phase of this research for these reasons. I also hope to give some recommendations for improving the university experiences of these students. So the final question that I asked them in the interview was, what would you change about higher education to make it a better place for students like you? So the recommendations that I'm going to give will really be co-created with the participants themselves and really grounded in their suggestions and their lived experiences. And a key priority for me is thinking about how we can center a greater ethics of care and how principles such as universal design for learning can be beneficial to everyone, not just neurodivergent students, but also racially minoritized and Black students. And I have the final meeting with my incredible advisors early next year, and I'll think about some creative ways to disseminate this research, both within and beyond academia, to the people that will benefit the most. So I'm really, really excited to do that. And yeah, I need to write my thesis now, which after all this work seems quite a scary and daunting experience, but yeah, that will be my next step. And that is all I have today. I've got a list of really long references in case anyone wants to revisit some of the sources that I shared at the start, but I will stop sharing my screen now.
And then I can just say thank you.
Yes.
Thank you ever so much, Jada. That was brilliant. I was completely drawn in. You are a great storyteller. Now, when you started off and you said, "Oh, I'm going to do some rambling," I like a good ramble. And you took us on this beautiful ramble that led us up in hope. Well, sometimes when I talk about how societies change, I look at there's a diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational model of Snow and Benford. And what you did very well was the diagnostic. You named the powers, you named the issues that students are facing. And then when you start talking about hope, that frames it in actually students are coming to university. Autistic Black students are thriving here. It's how do we make it better? How do we make it better for those who are doubly marginalized? I took notes. Look at that. It's fantastic. I want to thank you for starting off with talking about lenses. And when you came around to talking about both the double empathy problem and monotropism, it hit me that these are both autistic inspired and autistic created ideas, autistic created lenses, which we can bring to bear on these big subjects. You also, the other phrases that I picked up, I hadn't come across space invaders as an idea before. Oh, that's going to
That is
sing
a
to you for a
fabulous
little
book.
while.
I would recommend reading the book.
Absolutely fantastic. And then just after Space Invaders, the whole idea of subatomic racism and how I think we can extend that to subatomic ableism as well. So it was Trey who pointed out in the chat that there is the feeling of racism that's digested at the scale of a virus, that it gets within us, that ableism can become within us as a virus and it starts to spread
Mhm.
through our being. A lovely way of conceptualizing these kind of things. While I'm having a quick ramble, I do want to ask anyone if they want to drop questions in the Q&A or in the chat, please feel free to do so, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The fact that you're doing IPA, interpretive phenomenological analysis,
Mhm.
um, it's a great way of doing stuff. You're taking everybody's stories and then finding the common threads, the things that we can have to inspire each other. And in doing so, you start off with identity, the politics, and also the self-discovery of identity. You talk about senscapes. There are some. Why do universities still have bloody fluorescent lights? But it's not just the fluorescent lights. There's more than that. You talk about belonging and practice in anti-racist and neuroaffirming practice, the relationships of confidence building, um, and somehow that sometimes comes against academic rigidity. You talk about resistance. Oh, oh, I love it when people talk about resistance, because resistance, it leads to reform, or it can lead to revolution, different ways of taking things apart. You talk about the themes, you talk about the beautiful tensions that are there. So it's such a clever way of thinking about things. This isn't just a single monolithic way of being. These are tensions that are being held within real people. You talk about the wildfire of connection. When you were talking about flocking together and moving in the world and finding that home place, the world wildfire came out. That actually sometimes it takes a little spark and it sort of just burns and it becomes brighter. And that's when communities come together, they flock together and they look after each other. And it is a beautiful and hopeful thing to see.
Mm.
Then the multiple oppressions that actually, that when you are Black, when you're autistic, when you are female, you may find things coming your direction that all stack up together, and trying to see through them all to see what is at the root of it. Sometimes the interplay is at the root of it all. And that leads to a certain amount of exhaustion. The self advocacy itself becomes a labor. And then I think towards the end, you took that whole idea of self-advocacy, though, that exhaustion of having to ask for your needs to be met, and then you put it into a wider collective idea of advocacy for the community. It's not just advocacy for your needs, my needs, it's advocacy for our needs, that we find ourselves in others, and so we advocate our way through. Jada, that was brilliant. I'm going to ask now for questions. A few lovely things. So we've got informative and accessible ways of explaining your research. Lots of thank yous. We've got thank yous for amazing talks. Excited about to hear more. Um, Going to the Q&As. I do have one question. So I don't know if you know that I used to be university wellbeing and support before I crossed the dark line to become an academic. If I was back in my role and I was a specialist mentor for marginalized people of color, autistic people of color, as an ally, what would be one of the best things I could do?
That's a great question. I think one of the best things that you can do when it comes to anything like this is to speak to Black autistic, racially minoritized autistic people themselves, or read sources that are written from Black autistic or Black neurodivergent scholars. Because I think for me, reading from Black disabled, Black neurodivergent, Black autistic people really kind of transformed my perspective and helped me think. Because I obviously have always been quite proficient in anti-racism and understanding things like that. But even me 3 or 4 years ago didn't quite understand what it might be like with this intersection between race and autism. And I think you can't really understand that intersection unless you have lived experience or unless you learn from those people with lived experience. And I think that goes back to this whole idea of participatory research and why working with, when we're thinking about participatory research, how if we're working with autistic people, we need to include autistic people from diverse groups, whether that's Black autistic people, trans autistic people, because they're all going to have fundamentally, they're all going to have different ways of experiencing education and experiencing the world. It goes back to what I always say, that autistic people are never just autistic. They're always have something, always intersecting with all of their other identities. So I think if you're a mentor, if you're a lecturer, I think you always should seek sources that are from Black autistic people. But it's even if you have Black students or Black autistic students, just asking them, like, what is it that you would need from me? Because I think a lot of people in universities don't do that. Like, if they have students, what is it you need from me? Rather than waiting for them to come to you saying, I need this, approaching them and saying, what do you need from me?
And approaching them, and yet you mentioned this in it, you're approaching them with humility.
Yes.
Actually say, I do not know. And this is one of the binds that we sometimes find ourselves in universities, is we're supposed to know stuff. And it's very hard to be very open and say, actually, I don't know.
Yeah.
One of my answers to the I don't know stuff, I found a lovely book which was called Autistic and Black by Kala Allen Omizia.
I have it on my shelf.
Oh, you have
Yeah.
it on your shelf there. There we go.
Yes.
It was a thoroughly good read, particularly when I was working alongside students. In fact, I'm still mentoring students of colour. And it is a lovely thing to do because of the breadth within the book. That it's not just singular experiences, it's coming together and finding how they interplay with daily existence and those little microaggressions that are suffered. I hope I'm a good ally, and I want to be a better one. I have some wonderful questions coming up in the thing. So going to go for a question, first of all, from Zoe. It's Zoe. Zoe's lovely. I'm a big fan of Zoe. Thank you ever so much, she says. Great presentation. She has so many thoughts, but her main question was whether anything had come up in your individual analysis that differed for those who identified as Black from those who identified as coming from mixed heritage background.
I mean, well, I think, first of all, I don't know whether this is an autistic thing, but I think the students were very aware of their identities and were very aware of the things that affected them. Like, they were really articulate in saying, this is what is happening to me. I think I had only one or two Black mixed race students who participated. One of them spoke about her, she was very knowledgeable about this area. She was the one who had actually, she developed an anti-ableism course for supervisors, and she actually created an immersive training where she kind of simulated what it's like to experience sensory overload for lecturers, which I thought was great. But she was also very aware of how being mixed race and having kind of that proximity to whiteness meant that she was actually never really denied access to educational spaces. And she recognized that her privilege of that, and having not experienced things like colorism, and having actually she moved through education quite seamlessly, but it didn't prevent her from having the negative experiences such as racism. I can't tell you from my thoughts and brain right now whether there were actually any differences. I'm sure there are. But yeah, I guess that is something that I will need to think about. The student who was mixed race was the one who actually experienced ghost authorship. So you can see, even having that proximity to whiteness, even being mixed heritage, she still experienced some really kind of violent practices within higher education, which is really, really sad. But yeah, I appreciate that question because I think it is definitely something to consider, because I think there is definitely a difference between Black and Black mixed race experiences in education for sure. So
The hopeful part in me sees it. You mentioned sort of the privilege that they had, and that came together with insight to bring around institutional change. Privilege
yeah,
itself, when wielded by the good,
yeah.
might have something to do. But
And yeah,
yeah,
using that privilege to do something meaningful. Yeah.
uh, I have probably time for maybe one or two more questions. I've got this one. It might sort of trigger the whole Super Saiyan politics and injustice kind of thing. Do you think that the current political climate, particularly with Reform's UK influence and its stance on diversity and inclusion, will affect the experiences and representation of Black autistic individuals in education?
Well, yeah, because it will affect Black. If it affects Black students generally, it's going to affect Black autistic students. I think I think when if we talk about Black autistic students, I think sometimes we end up seeing them as like they are their own individual little group, but they are are still Black students and still represent the wider Black community and students. And I think all the things going on in the world at the minute are obviously, like I said before, they seep into higher education. I mean, if we look at the minute when we think about the intense policing and surveillance on campuses at the moment, um, even thinking about I know where I am at university, thinking about all the students who were out protesting for Palestine and after the race riots recently, but they're constantly being watched. And I think student mobilization as well at the minute is definitely impacted. And I think this, yeah, is gonna I think it impacts how students feel being at university, but it also impacts um, who is advocating for them. Um, I think I'm definitely going to have to relate it to the wider political and social context. But it will 100% impact them if it impacts, I think, all marginalized students at
And
the
I
moment.
think you make a very important about the being watched part of it, that particularly for a lot of autistic folk, I hear stories about a sensitivity to being under scrutiny. I think it's Diana Murray that wrote quite eloquently about it.
Mm.
And this means that the panopticon that we now live in becomes an oppressive mechanism in its own right, which is why last month I took my sandwiches across to go and tell Jeremy Bentham's pickled body that it was a stupid idea he came up with in the first place, which is the joys of UCL. Time is unfortunately upon us. We still had lovely questions. I'm so sorry we didn't have time to get around to it. I want to thank everyone who has given up their time to come and join us. Jada, thank you ever so much. I love listening to you, and we'll grab a coffee again soon, all right?
Yes, of
Brilliant stuff.
course.
I'm going to ask everyone, look after yourselves, take care, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.